All right, well, thanks everybody for joining me today. My name is Kolakowski. It's my honor and privilege to be the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in downtown Madison. I hope for those of you who haven't been down in a while, please come down and see us. We got some really exciting things going on. I'm also chair of the Wisconsin America 250 Commission and leading a legislatively created commission charged with basically helping the state mark the 250th birthday of the United States. And so it's kind of with wearing both of those hats are why I'm here today, and I'm going to talk a little bit kind of in advance of Memorial Day. This is what we're going to talk about today, and if you get nothing else out of this, is I want to give you some things to think about as we approach Memorial Day and as we approach July 4th, 2026. And you know, a lot of people are making July 4th, 2026 about what happened 250 years ago in Philadelphia, and yes, that's a part of it. But in reality, and this is something that we are adamant about here, is that this is actually about the journey toward a more perfect union that started 250 years ago and continues right up to this day and will continue long past this day as well. So if you get nothing else out of this presentation, I want you to walk away with that. But everything that I'm going to talk about is going to fit under that overall heading. So we're going to talk a little bit about July 4th and a little bit about that, give you some reflections, talk also about Wisconsin's connections to the Revolution, which are more than you think. And then talk a little bit about Wisconsin military service and the tradition that started 250 years ago that Wisconsinites have fit into and continue to fit into ever since. And then if we got time, we'll have some questions at the end. Hopefully I'm not too long-winded. And so with that, let's start here. We've already talked a little bit about July 4th, 2026 is the independence of the United States. 250 years. July 4th, 1776, of course, the Declaration of Independence. But it is worth pointing out, and I will show you a little bit more on a few other slides, the first national institutions are older than the Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress was 1774, and then the United States had an Army, a Navy, and a Marine Corps before we were an independent nation. The United States Army was created June 14th, 1775, the United States Navy October 13th, 1775, and the United States Marine Corps November 10th, 1775. In fact, 250 years ago this summer and fall, the Navy will fight and win its first victories at Lake Champlain up in northeast New York. So that's something to remember, is that as long, in fact, even longer than there has been in America, in independent America, Americans have been willing to stand up, bear arms, and defend first the United Colonies and now the United States of America. And that's a powerful thing. I don't think a lot of people realize that, even though we made a big deal about marking the 250th birthdays of those services and the military in general, by the way. For all the Air Force vets and the Coast Guard vets and everybody else, I always point out that the birthday of the U.S. military is the Army's birthday also. By marking that, that's where the tradition starts. And I would argue the National Guard always likes to point out that the Guard goes back to the colonial militia in the 1630s. So it's a long tradition, long tradition, even before July 4th, 1776. But that spark and the values that are espoused in the Declaration of Independence are the aspirations of this country ever since. And that begins that journey toward a more perfect union, as the U.S. Constitution talks about. And I've talked about, that's why I say the Declaration of Independence, secured by that service. To be honest, that document wouldn't have meant anything if we didn't actually win the war. And that war was decided on the battlefield. And then, if we didn't win subsequent wars to keep this country alive, and in case of the Civil War, to keep this country united. And so that is something that should be mentioned and should be remembered. And it's all part of this ongoing journey toward a more perfect union over the last 2.5 centuries. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but here we are. So let's drill in a little bit further on some of this, and particularly as we're approaching Memorial Day, I want to drill in a little bit more on this tradition. We already talked about the Army, Navy, and the Marine Corps. Memorial Day itself has a long tradition as well. It dates back to our Civil War, which is still our largest and bloodiest war. The bloodiest war, that is, by casualties. The largest one by people served is actually World War II. Immediately after that war, there became a movement in North and South to memorialize this vast amount of dead 750,000 by the top estimates, 625,000. Out of a nation of 30 million, that's 2% of the population. If you were to do that number today, it would be over 7 million just dead, to say nothing of the wounded, crippled, others that come back as well. It's no accident that you start to get first veterans homes after the Civil War, including Old Main up in Milwaukee. So this war, we name a generation before, 50 years before World War I. If you look at World War I and its impact on Europe, in fact, Europeans would later say, oh yeah, the U.S. Civil War impacted America just like World War I impacted us in Britain or France or things like that. Not getting too far out into the weeds on that. But that's also why our Memorial Day is different from most of our World War I allies. Theirs is November the 11th, their Remembrance Day, as they call it. We had already named the generation before they did. And that's what happened during the Civil War. And in 1868, the head of the Grand Army of the Republic, which is the Union Veterans Organization, a guy named John Logan, passed a proclamation that picked May 30th, starting in 1868, and every year that would be Decoration Day. And it was later codified into federal law as Memorial Day. So when you think about Memorial Day, you think about where it comes from, that's where it comes from. Why did he pick May 30th? Because it's not a major anniversary of any major battles. It was a neutral day. He didn't want it tied to a specific thing. He wanted it tied to a specific time of year. Plus the flowers are blooming, you know, for decorating graves, things like that. But that is where our tradition comes from. And it wasn't just, he never wanted it to be just about the Civil War or one battle or anything like that. It's about all veterans who paid the ultimate sacrifice on any battlefield in our nation's history, past, present, or future. And so that's what we do on Memorial Day. That's what you do, and I would encourage you when you think about Memorial Day coming up, or when you go out to the cemetery for one of the ceremonies, that's the tradition that we're part of. And it's important to remember that. We stand on the shoulders of that generation. We stand on the shoulders of those that have gone before. You can see that bullet right there, the cost of freedom, and honoring those who paid for Independence Day, not just in 1775 and 76, but right up to 2026 and beyond. And of course, down here, Southern Wisconsin Veterans Cemetery, we've got the one up at King, and of course the one up in Northern, in addition to the federal cemeteries here in Wisconsin, and then of course many others elsewhere. So let's talk a little bit about Wisconsin and the American Revolution. Talked a little bit about the tradition, kind of how Wisconsin fits into it. Let's talk about Wisconsin and the American Revolution. Wisconsin, of course, became a state in 1848. So we obviously didn't exist. Matter of fact, the territory that would become the state of Wisconsin didn't become U.S. territory. Does anybody know? 1783, the Treaty of Paris, the treaty that formalized the end of the war and formally ratified the Declaration of Independence, when Britain basically signed away their rights, their claims to the colonies. The territory they signed away included what is now the state of Wisconsin. So most people don't realize Wisconsin had been U.S. territory that long. So the territory becomes a part of the United States as a direct result of the Revolution. And the other thing we always like to point out to people is that, yes, the Revolution happened on the East Coast, mostly. But over the next couple of generations, people moved out here. The descendants of the Revolutionary War generation, you will find that their children start moving west. Their grandchildren will end up here. Sometimes their children, and sometimes the veterans themselves, as we'll explore here in just a second. And so, to understand us as Badgers, and to understand who forms this state, to a certain extent, you've got to understand the Revolutionary War generation. And it shows up on our map. Look at all these place names and county names that are direct ties and direct callbacks to the American Revolution. Lafayette County, Fayette, Wisconsin, both the Marquis de Lafayette. Greene County, named for one of Washington's generals. Same with Sullivan. Franklin, of course, Ben Franklin. That needs no introduction. Mercer. Actually, that was a guy who was from my hometown. He got killed at the Battle of Princeton. Adams County, John Adams. Vernon County, Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. Sumter, which is Thomas Sumter of South Carolina, general. Broadhead, Wisconsin, another general. Allen's Grove, that's Ethan Allen, the famous Green Mountain Boys. Pulaski, Wisconsin, the famous cavalry commander. Oneida County, the Oneida Native tribes. We'll talk about them in the Naval Service in a few minutes. South Wayne, Anthony Wayne, kind of the George Washington of the West in a lot of ways in terms of conquering and opening up the West, winning some important victories. And of course, two names that require no introduction, Washington and Jefferson, giving two names to counties. These is just a small sample of how, you know, when you go places and you found a new place, who you choose to name it for, and the symbols that you choose to bring along and incorporate into this new community, really give you an idea of who you are and what you value. And so the fact that we have this many, and this is only the tip of the iceberg, Revolutionary War ties to our place names, tells you something. That says something, doesn't it? And it goes back to what I said earlier. To understand us as Badgers today, you've got to understand the Revolution. By the way, 42 veterans of the American Revolution are buried here in the state. Most people don't realize there's that many. Most people don't even think there's any to begin with, to be blunt with you. But here we are. And you can see, yes, this map is a Rorschach test, but you can see generally where they are, which makes sense considering how the state was settled, kind of down from the southern part up to the north. We do have an interactive version of this map online on the museum website if you want to check that out. And frankly, I may be biased, but if you have a little bit of time to kill, it is worth checking out. I will run through a few of the stories here just to give you an idea of some of the people that we have. Nathaniel Ames, I'm actually going to do the last one first. Nathaniel Ames was born in 1761. He served in several Connecticut regiments and in the United States Navy during the war. He moved in 1836 out here. His family had moved first, and he realized he needed somebody to take care of him, so moved out here and died at the age of 102 in Oregon, Wisconsin, where he is buried today. He's the last War of Independence veteran to be alive in the state of Wisconsin. Now, think about his life in those 102 years. He's born in 1761. This was still, at the time, Quebec, because it wouldn't be signed over to the British until 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, as they called it in Europe. So he's born when this is French territory. He's a British subject. When he dies in 1863, this is the 30th state in the Union. It's part of the United States, and he has children in the Union Army fighting to preserve the Union. And we're halfway through the Civil War. You talk about a life of change in that time. To say nothing of technology, railroads, steamships, to head the list, the telegraph. I mean, there's so many things that you could do just looking at his lifetime. But it's a tremendous, I invite you later to kind of think about that and unpack that a little bit more. Elisha Brown, Connecticut, 1760. He enlisted in a New Hampshire regiment and served mostly up in New York. Some of you may be familiar with the story. You're going to hear this again here in another future Wisconsin connection to it. 1780, Benedict Arnold decided to sell out the country, and he decided to sell out West Point. And one of the sentries guarding West Point was this guy, Ileana Brown. Arnold, of course, was unsuccessful in selling out West Point. He almost was able to get the British to capture George Washington, as a matter of fact. He escaped down the river at the, basically by the skin of his teeth. Raised a huge alarm, and of course, Benedict Arnold, of course, is the great American traitor today, and deservedly so. Well, one of the sentries that was on duty, and kind of Benedict Arnold had to evade, for lack of a better term, was him. He's buried in Jefferson, Wisconsin. He moved to Wisconsin in 1838, again for a very similar reason, and died in 1855 at the age of 95, is buried over in Jefferson. Nathan Hatch. Nathan Hatch was born in Massachusetts in 1757. He enlisted in 1776 at the age of 19. Can you imagine that? 19 years old, this brand new country, taking up arms. That tells you a lot, doesn't it? So, was present at the hanging of Major Andre. This is the other part of the story, because Benedict Arnold had been going back and forth with surreptitious correspondence with the British in New York. And they said, we're going to send somebody up to make the final negotiation with you as to how you're basically going to hand over West Point to us. And they entrusted it to a guy named Major John Andre, who met with Benedict Arnold and started back to New York. This would be September 1780. And starts back to New York, where he's captured by Connecticut militia. Underneath his jacket, he's wearing civilian clothes, but underneath his jacket, he is wearing a British Army uniform. But that's not enough. They find incriminating papers on him. And when Arnold gets the report that this British spy's been captured with papers, they don't know exactly what, they haven't read them yet. And when Arnold hears that, I got to get out of here. And so that's when he escapes. Andre is not so fortunate. Andre ultimately will be, that's basically he's caught red-handed. And the correspondence between him and Arnold is so incredibly damning that he's hung as a spy in October of 1780. And one of the people that was present is this guy, Nathan Hatch, who moved to Wisconsin in 1843, died in 1847 at the age of 90, and he is buried in Brookfield. Actually, if you ever go to the Brookfield Public Library, I'm speaking there on Thursday, they actually have some of his artifacts on display in the lobby. They're actually, Brookfield, deservedly so, is very proud of their Revolutionary War veteran. But again, these are stories, you may have heard of some of these stories in the past. You may have heard of Benedict Arnold and his treason. You may have heard of him trying to sell out West Point, things like that. I lived in upstate New York, so I heard this stuff all the time. But you may never have realized that there was a Wisconsin veteran or Wisconsin connection. So these will win you bar bets one day. There you go. David Paddock, who's actually buried not far from here, or so we think. Born in 1753, fights at the Battle of Bemis Heights at Saratoga, which is Saratoga National Battlefield. I had the privilege of being on staff there for a year when I was in graduate school. It's an incredible battlefield if you ever get a chance to go up there. The New York Times, having talked to a bunch of historians, voted this the most important event of the last millennium. Why is that, you ask? Because we fight and win the Battle of Saratoga, and when we forced Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne to surrender in October of 1777, it has two important effects. Number one, it is the first complete British Army to surrender ever in the history of the British Army. Number two, when word of Saratoga reaches Paris, Ben Franklin takes it to Louis XVI and says, look at what we did. And of course, the French are itching for a rematch from the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And so Saratoga directly brings in the French and the Spanish on our side, which ultimately tips the balance over, of course, several years of very hard fighting to win the war and to win our independence. In fact, I would argue, by the way, just to put a complete cherry on top of this argument, half of Washington's army at Yorktown was French. Most people don't realize that. So that gives you an idea of the scale of support we got, particularly from France. And France remains our oldest ally to this day. It's all because of the victory at Saratoga. David Paddock was there in the New York militia, and he lost his sight at the age of 24. He lived until 1847. So that is, by my math, 70 years as a blind man in this country. He became known as Blind David. In fact, you might be able to see right here on the memorial stone, known as Blind David. But yet he made his way out here. He had children. One of his children moved to Wisconsin. He came with him in 1838 and settled in Kenosha County. We don't know much about him. We don't actually even know exactly where he is, because this memorial stone sits on a golf course where he's believed to be buried in what used to be an old family cemetery. But the records, unfortunately, have been lost. But there is a memorial stone to him that you can find on Find a Grave to old David Paddock. But, this country, when he fights at Bemis Heights, it's October of 1777. This country is not even a year and a half old as an independent nation. And he sacrifices his sight in its defense. And that is worthy of remembrance and respect. I do want to talk about the native nations a little bit, because this is something else that should be mentioned. Of the 11 native nations that are in Wisconsin right now, 2 were on the East Coast during the War of Independence, and they served with the United States and served on behalf of the United States. The Oneida served with U.S. forces in the New York campaigns of 1776 and 1777, most notably helping win the battle at Fort Stanwix. Now, for those of you who may or may not be aware of Fort Stanwix, in 1777, the British had a plan to move Burgoyne straight south from Montreal down to Albany, while another force from Lake Ontario was going to come across and meet him at Albany as well, and hopefully cut off the New England states from the rest of the United States. Burgoyne gets stopped at Saratoga. The other force, under a guy named Barry St. Leger, moves in this direction and is stopped at Oriskany and Fort Stanwix in the summer of 1777. And they actually ambush his army pretty badly with the help of the Oneida Scouts. In fact, the Oneida Scouts provide essential intelligence to the Americans. And a lot of the Americans that win at Fort Stanwix then turn around and help win at Saratoga in September and October. So I would invite you to read up on these campaigns, which will be happening 250 years ago next year. It's one of the key moments of the campaign. I may be biased having been up there for a while. And then the other one I'll mention is the Stockbridge-Munsee, which is part of the Mohican Nation. They served with the Continental Army, and these are the most notable periods of their service. And Boston, 1775. There were 3 native nations that showed up when, after Lexington and Concord, they forced the British back into Boston, and then all the Minutemen and all the state militias, particularly from New England, join up to besiege the British in Boston. And among those that show up, some spontaneously, some by order, but I believe spontaneously for all 3 of these, but among those that showed up was the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Nation out of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And they're now out here in Wisconsin. And they served with distinction all through the Siege of Boston in 1775 to 1776, and they go to New York and fight in the New York campaigns down there, and then in the area around West Point, 1777 and 1778. And then basically upstate New York, skirmishing in upstate New York for the rest of the war. But these are natives. We talk about how even today, Native Americans serve in the United States Armed Forces. In fact, relative to their communities, the highest percentage of service of any community in the United States is the Native Americans. That tradition goes back to 1775. And that should be remembered for sure. And one of the ones that's buried here is, I'm not going to try his last name, but he was actually a son of one of the chiefs of the Stockbridge-Munsee. Served in the William Goodrich's Company of Indians at Boston, later appointed captain by George Washington, used as a scout, and then served again in the War of 1812, before coming out here in the middle part of the 19th century, and is buried today in Allegheny County. So when we think about American Revolution, we think about Wisconsin Revolutionary War veterans, we should never forget the diversity of some of these stories and some of these origins, for sure. Racine County, which we are in, actually, you all win the prize. There are 10 American Revolutionary War graves here, most of any county of the 72 counties in Wisconsin. As you can imagine, most of them have 0, but there are a few that have them, and Racine has the most. And just threw this in as well, this is one of the prominent cemeteries here, but it's also where the mound is, one of the burial mounds as well. You all probably know more about that than I do, to be honest with you. I haven't had a chance to visit it yet. But it's worth noting. And when you think, again, when you look at that map and you think about the development of the state, you see why they cluster in some of these areas, particularly coming across the Great Lakes or coming up from the southern, from Illinois and settling here in Wisconsin. You can really kind of trace the early development of the state by where these patriots end up being buried. I want to talk a little bit about the tradition that they start, because Wisconsin, when the Civil War starts in 1861, Wisconsin's been a state for 13 years. This is the first time that Wisconsin is going to go serve, Wisconsinites are going to go serve as a state in defense of the United States. It's a big moment for us. It's why even today, enduring state symbols from the Civil War, like our state flag, our state song, Camp Randall, Old Abe, continue to resonate today, is because it goes back to that period. And as you can see from the illustration right here, they looked back to their revolutionary forefathers for inspiration. And for those of you who can't see this, this is actually from our collection at the Veterans Museum. The past, George Washington figure holding an American flag. The present, a suave figure, Civil War soldier with the number 1861, that has the number 1776, holding an American flag, kind of crossing over each other, building that connection. And there are some descendants. This is what I talked about earlier about the last generation or the next generations. There's some of those descendants that will serve in the Civil War, and probably are names that you recognize but didn't realize they had a Revolutionary War connection. Two units I will single out. Number one is the 1st Wisconsin, which was the old Milwaukee Light Guard out of the Milwaukee Militia. And their first flag, it was the mayor of Racine had somehow possession of a fragment of George Washington's headquarters guard flag. And he had a ceremony with them and affixed it to their colors when they went off to go fight in 1861 and said, "You are going to carry this with you," making a physical connection between George Washington's headquarters guard and the 1st Wisconsin Infantry, which was the first unit Wisconsin ever sent to the U.S. Army. 37th Wisconsin, 2 companies of the 37th Wisconsin, which was raised in 1864, were raised out of the Oneida Reservation. And so you have descendants of Oneida veterans of the Revolutionary War now going to preserve the Union in the 37th. When you read their roster, it's really interesting how they anglicize some of those names. I'll just leave it at that. Some of these other names you may or may not recognize, but all have Revolutionary War veterans and perfectly illustrate what I was talking about earlier about the next generations coming out here. The Iron Brigade. Most people know the Iron Brigade. But did you know that the first commander, Rufus King, his grandfather signed both the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence? His son Charles, King Veterans Home, that's the namesake. So that's a tie back to the Revolution. Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin, perhaps certainly one of the most famous memoirists of that brigade, certainly one of the most famous memoirists perhaps of Wisconsin from the war. Commander of the 6th through most of the war. Revolutionary War ties. Does anybody know where that name comes from? Paul Revere. Paul Revere had another rider that night, William Dawes. That's grandfather of Rufus. Rufus's son will later become the chief quartermaster of John Pershing's American Expeditionary Force in World War I and will be vice president of the United States 100 years ago right now. So you talk about a family of service going all the way back to the Revolution, 150 years or so of service. And then Charles Hamilton, who commanded the 7th Wisconsin for quite a bit of time during the war. I'm sure you all can probably guess who Grandpa was. Alexander. They made a musical about it if you haven't checked that out. But that's one of Alexander Hamilton's descendants, commanding the 7th Wisconsin in the Iron Brigade. I threw in old Henry Luddington here because in 1876, the country turns 100. And they had a huge party in Philadelphia called the Centennial Exposition. If you ever get a chance to read about it, you can still visit some of the old sites in Philadelphia. It's really, really cool. One of the things that they sent for the Wisconsin kind of pavilion was they sent Old Abe, the War Eagle, who was the mascot of the 8th Wisconsin Infantry. And Old Abe was retired by this point. He'd survived the war. And he's come back. He's been living in the basement of the Capitol. And you could take Old Abe, and he was put on display. And for 2 cents, you could buy an Old Abe postcard. For 5 cents, you could get an autographed postcard. Now, the question is, how does an eagle autograph the postcard? I've had school children say, scratch it with the claw. Does he poop on it? Does he pee on it? The answer is none of those. Old Abe had a problem with people getting too close. And so you'd get up to him, and he'd start to snap. And when he snaps, put the card right in, he bites down on it. And so if you get an Old Abe postcard today that has a little V in it, that's the autograph from Old Abe. So he was a huge hit. On the back of all of those cards was the newly elected governor, Henry Luddington, who had just taken office in January of 1876. Henry Luddington, and I only discovered this a few weeks ago, Henry Luddington had his own Revolutionary War ancestors. And it goes back to the night of Paul Revere's ride also. Because there was a third rider, Sybil Luddington, the only documented female rider on that evening. One of her brothers was one of Washington's aides de camp later in the war. So Henry Luddington is a descendant of both of them. And he's governor during the centennial year. That's another one of maybe a trivia contest. But anytime you see one of those postcards of Old Abe, flip it over, and you'll see not just a great Wisconsin tie to the Civil War, but you'll see a great Wisconsin tie in the form of the governor on the back to the Revolutionary War as well. And the 8th Wisconsin has its own Revolutionary War connection, and that is the commander for most of the war, John Jefferson. And you can probably guess who his grandfather was. Thomas. He served the entire Civil War not wanting anybody to know that. Why, you may be wondering? Not because of who his grandfather was. It's because his grandmother was Sally Hemings, Jefferson's enslaved person. In a segregated army, as that was, had that been known, he would have been drummed out immediately. No matter the fact that he was a senior officer, colonel, he had an outstanding combat record, wouldn't have mattered. He would have been drummed out and come home. He's from Madison. He and his family had moved to Madison. His father opened a hotel in Madison shortly before the war. And then they're actually buried in Madison today at Forest Hill Cemetery. And Jefferson was one other thing I was going to mention about Jefferson, and I completely slipped my mind. If I think of it, I'll come back to it. But John Jefferson is, I know what it was. He's the highest ranked African descent officer in the entire Civil War. And he didn't want anybody to know about it. I invite you to think about that later after this presentation. We talked a little bit about the 1st Wisconsin, but I do want to talk about a couple of people that were involved with the 1st Wisconsin as well. John Starkweather, who was buried up in Forest Home, by the way, and later was the postmaster of Oconomowoc, was the first commander of the 1st Wisconsin. He was the captain of the Milwaukee Light Guard, which today is the 127th Infantry of Wisconsin National Guard. John Starkweather had an ancestor who fought in the Massachusetts militia at Bunker Hill. His color sergeant, John Putnam. John Putnam's ancestor was Starkweather's ancestor's commander, Israel Putnam, who was the defender of Bunker Hill in 1775. And it was a big deal. The newspapers made note of that fact. And there are many, many more, including my family. I had family that was fighting against the British from Pennsylvania, from New Hampshire, from Massachusetts, that later all ended up coming out here and settling mostly down in Greene County, down around New Glarus and things like that. But if you think about it, there are a lot, I bring that up simply to say, there are a lot of us Badgers that when you start to dig in and scratch the surface, you find where it came from. You know, in 1861, in the 1861 census, just quick kind of put paid to some of this. Do you know what of the 775,000 Badgers that lived in Wisconsin in 1861, do you know where most of them were born? 25% of them were born? The state of New York. And so you get people that come across from New England through New York, just like my family, and across the Great Lakes. And you see it today, by the way, in some of the place names there, too. Albany, Brooklyn, things like that. Utica. All these different place names. Heck, even the name of our legislature comes from the state of New York. But I digress. But it gives you an idea. You know, what happened in the East before 1848 is not detached from us. In fact, who we are started there. And that actually is a perfect segue into this. We've already talked about how the area that became Wisconsin, right here, became a U.S. territory in 1783. When it's time to write the Constitution for us to become a state in 1848, where do we reach back to for our inspiration? The United States Constitution. In Wisconsin, and this will win you a bar bet, oldest constitution in continuous use outside of New England. Connecticut and New Hampshire are older. When you think about what public servants, what veterans, what military people raise their hand to, what do they raise their hand to? I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Yes, we took the same thing. This is what they're swearing to. Who we are as Badgers comes directly from the Wisconsin Constitution. Where did that come from? The U.S. Constitution. It comes from the revolutionary ideals being realized in a new state. And this is not just a Wisconsin story. This is true of other states across this great land of ours. But for us, that's how it comes across. Most people may not think about it, but I invite you, as we are approaching July 4th, as we're approaching Memorial Day, as we're approaching Veterans Day later this year, think about those things. And this is what I mean when I talked at the very beginning about the tradition of which Wisconsin is a part, and the journey toward a more perfect union, and sum it up very well, building the state on the ideals of our forefathers. And so just before I open it for questions, I did want to kind of talk about how this legacy manifests itself today, some things that you can kind of see today. And yes, as an employee of the Department of Veterans Affairs, I am going to shade this a little bit. But first of all, is the Wisconsin National Guard. Anybody ever seen the symbol, the seal of the National Guard of the United States? It's got a Minuteman on it, which is a direct callback to the militia of Lexington and Concord in 1775. And we've already talked about how the National Guard has a tradition back to the 1600s with the colonial militia. That is the tradition that Wisconsin as a new state slid right into and continues to play its fullest part right up to this very minute. Of course, Southern Wisconsin Cemetery, Southern Wisconsin Veterans Home. You serve the country. As Abraham Lincoln said, we have an obligation to you to care for them who have borne the battle, the widows and the orphans. And it is the fulfillment of that obligation that the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs exists, does what it does, not just here, but up at King, and obviously up at Chippewa Falls and Spooner as well. And then the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, which turned 125 last month, is the state military museum, and in many ways the memory of Wisconsin and Wisconsin veterans here in the state. And again, come on down and see us in Madison. And then, of course, the Department of Veterans Affairs. So hopefully in the time that I've had today, you get a little bit of a sense of what this really means. What Memorial Day 2026 really means, what July 4th 2026 is going to mean, what the rest of this year means, and how what we are doing and what we are commemorating this year, the 250th anniversary, is something really powerful, and is something that is enduring, and is something that really is a way to reflect on who we are as Americans, what it has taken to defend and sustain this country, build a more perfect union, and also what it means to be a citizen, and what it means to be in this country, and help build this country and build that more perfect union. And the great tradition that Wisconsin fits into. Again, who we are as Americans, but also who we are as Badgers. That's my contact info if you want to know more. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you all very much.